to another live. We continue with His Holiness, His Eminence Chetsang Rinpoche's biography. And as the title photo shows, it is the book cover of Dr. Melvin Goldstein, a prominent anthropologist on Tibet's book on the Cultural Revolution in Tibet, especially focusing on a particular nun who revolted with a group of people and attacked all state apparatuses during this time in the name of the Cultural Revolution. So it's very interesting to compare with certain female behavior in the current Israel-Palestine conflict, as it differs largely from a lot of the male reactions. During huge political conflicts, one can expect different behaviors of male and females because I guess they just interpret events differently here sometimes. Not all the time. Like, I don't want to be a gender essentialist, but yeah. Long live the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and I take refuge in the 3 gems before we start this really tumultuous time period of public executions, etc., etc. Some people have not fully healed from this time, and I am so lucky to have been born, at least in this current lifetime, after this whole history. It's just, okay. In early 1968, not 2024. In early 1968, the fighting between the rival factions began to die down in most of China, but in Tibet, the conflicts continued. 2 new People's Liberation Army divisions were dispatched into the country to contain the fighting, and the army took over the schools. Students were now given paramilitary training instead of instruction in school subjects. The students of the middle school were drilled like army recruits, and the PLA troops were posted in every classroom and dormitory. Senior students and Red Guards were trained in close combat techniques with fixed bayonets, while Rinpoche and his classmates were mostly drilled in marching and standing at attention. Li Zheng, Shaoxi. Those are like the drill terms that we even use in our gym classes during, school. It's similar to the military style, and even some students go for military training for the purpose of studying. It's part of the education now in modern day post-Cultural Revolution mainland China. Once the entire student body, trigger warning, was summoned to witness an execution. It began with a rally to inform the crowd of the crimes of the delinquents, 1 Tibetan and 1 Chinese. The Tibetan was a former monk accused of being the ringleader of imperialist spies, and the Chinese man was charged with having smuggled watches. They were paraded before the Jokhang. I got this book today. The Tibetan ceaselessly repeating His Holiness the Dalai Lama's name, Tenzin Gyatso. Long live His Holiness. The guards brutally pounded the Tibetan's head against a stone wall. The blood streamed over his face and dripped from his fingers. Distressed, Rinpoche and his friends slipped away into the crowd and headed back toward the school. Just before they arrived, they saw a small group of people next to a truck and ran over to see what was happening. They pushed their way to the front and were horrified to discover that the condemned men had been brought there, a mere stone throws away from the school, to be executed. The 2 men were dragged from the truck to a wall and summarily shot. The crowd immediately began to shove and push forward, and Rinpoche, standing in the front, was only able to keep himself from being toppled onto the dead bodies by making a desperate leap over them. Oh, gosh. This is so disturbing. Anyways, here's the Tibetan flag. After this experience, he fell into a depression and could not eat for days. On September 5th, 1968, a revolutionary committee was set up in Tibet. the last region under Chinese control to receive one. The revolutionary committees were to be a three-way alliance between the army, civil cadres, and workers, and the previous party functionaries and military commanders were removed from power. Wang Qimei was neutralized and Zhou Renshan committed suicide. The Revolutionary Committee was supposed to officially end the fighting between the Genlong and the Nyangzhe, but resentments simmered. In October 1968, Mao finally succeeded in removing his rival Liu Shaoqi from power and expelling him from the Communist Party. And in spring of 1969, Mao had the PLA disarm and dissolve the Red Guards. The rabid young students had saved Mao from losing his grip on power, but now they had become a liability. They were to be dispersed, sent to the countryside in order to thoroughly purify their old modes of thinking through physical labor. Pew, 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 pew. Fields and livestock had been neglected during the years of intense factional fighting, and agricultural production had reached its nadir, lowest point. SAT words, SAT vocab. The students and Red Guards would now be more useful as agricultural laborers than as cultural revolutionaries. They were sent to remote regions to purge and renew their minds, but the city youths disdained the dirt-covered peasants and their miserable living conditions and saw their exile as an undeserved punishment. Many were unable to cope with the unfamiliar circumstances, the harsh living conditions, and the brutally hard work. Rinpoche and a few of his classmates were fortunate enough to be sent to communal labor camps of the district of Tolung, about 30 minutes by bus to the west of Lhasa. So this is in Lhasa. They were going west of Lhasa. Rinpoche's closest friends wanted to keep the group together to protect their middle school lama, afraid that he would be badly treated on account of his class background. They succeeded, and the group of 6 young men set off to their work brigades and production teams in the Tonga commune of Tolung. Tonga commune of Tolung, consisting of 4 villages and their sub-communes. Rinpoche and one of his schoolmates were assigned to the production team of the People's Commune. The other 4 were divided up between 2 other communes. The director was a high-ranking party functionary, and each work team was led by a village headman. Rinpoche shared a small room in a modest building with his companion. Each had been given a cup and a cooking pot and nothing more. Except for the local authorities, no one in his new surroundings knew that he was the Drikung Kyabgong Rinpoche. Thank goodness. Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum. He rose before dawn, cleaned the stables, and fed the animals, and then went to work in the fields until late in the evening. He walked 20 minutes to fetch water from a stream, carrying it in a large canister strapped to his back. Now and then he had to attend commune meetings. The villagers were generally fearful of informers and therefore suspicious of the cadres and all other outsiders, but they felt comfortable and safe with Rinpoche. He was ready to help whenever he could, and right from the beginning he was esteemed by both the peasants and the leadership, who all trusted him and treated him with natural and spontaneous respect. This is a picture of Mao with Panchen Lama and His Holiness Dalai Lama. This is the former Panchen, 10th. Okay. Rinpoche had been in Tonga only a few months when the wife of the village headman was about to give birth. So we have some Tibetan women with the Mao portrait. Okay, women were about to give birth. The headman asked Rinpoche to accompany him to Lhasa since his wife was no longer young and the delivery was not without dangers. When they arrived in Lhasa, the village headman called on a friend who worked for the newspaper to ask if he knew a good doctor. Drepung. So this is 1997, and it still was not rebuilt, at least in 97, after the destruction. So So you can see how bad it was. Okay, the journalist made a quick phone call and gave him a name and then apologized for not having any more time that day because Annie Trinley Chodong was being brought to Lhasa for her execution. This is the nun I mentioned in the beginning of this live. All captured rebels who had been fighting Chinese rule guerrilla style along with her were to be executed simultaneously the next day in Lhasa, Lokha, Nagchu, and Chamdo, so like 4 different places around Tibet. The journalist himself had to go to Lokha to photograph the execution. Chinle Chodron was a legendary figure of mythic proportions. Although she was a nun, Ani, in June 1969, she and a band of followers had murdered 14 cadres and soldiers of the People's Liberation Army propaganda team in Nimo, dispatching their victims with appalling brutality. They had burned a few Chinese alive and had amputated the arms or legs of others. In the beginning, the party had viewed the actions of Chinle Chodron's group as normal excesses of the Cultural Revolution's work to purge the party leadership of reactionary elements. In fact, the group's true motivations were entirely different. Under the cloak of the officially sanctioned Cultural Revolution, Chinle Chodron's rebellion was directed at the occupiers in general and was developing into a national uprising. She gathered hundreds of supporters in a very short time, rapidly won over 18 districts, and her support among the general population continued to increase as the revolt took on the form of a millenarian uprising. Some scholars have compared it to the Taiping Rebellion of the 1800s in mainland China. Everywhere, bands of Tibetan nationalists began to hunt down Chinese cadres and their Tibetan supporters. In Chamdo, they had cornered a former Tibetan student from Rinpoche's middle school who was working in the local administration. The murderous crew had already stabbed all of the local officials to death when they trapped him in the storage room where he was trying to hide. In desperation, he recited the 6-syllable mantra of Chenrezig. He faced, and the band spared him because he was saved, I guess, by Chenrezig. Do we have Chenrezig? No, we don't. Okay. He faced more difficulties, though, when the army arrived and forced him to explain why he alone had been spared. By the time the Chinese finally understood the true aim of the firestorm Chinle Chodron sparked, it was almost too late. Ani Chinle Chodron had become a legend, and there was a rumor that she was possessed by a local protector deity and had magical powers. She was believed to be invulnerable, and stories were told about she had been put in prison and had escaped by supernatural means. In the end, strong military units were sent to Nimo and other districts to crush the revolt, and she fled to the mountains to continue the guerrilla war. But eventually, Chinle Chodron and 15 of her followers were captured. Tibet had been on the brink of a nationwide uprising such as this one in 1959, and most people in Lhasa were genuinely surprised at the news of her capture, having needed so desperately to believe in an invincible savior. On the next day, Chetsang Rinpoche rode to the stadium on a bicycle he had borrowed from some relatives. While the terrible deeds of Chinle Chodron and her followers were described in detail over loudspeakers, the newest weapons of the PLA were paraded before the audience. Brand new machine guns and an unimaginably long cannon on a specially built transport vehicle with gigantic wheels that rolled slowly past the astonished crowd. Rinpoche wondered how the Chinese had succeeded in bringing this monstrosity to Tibet without causing a great stir among the Tibetans. The message was clear: you are helpless against an arsenal like this, even with magical abilities. Then the 16 bound prisoners were driven into the stadium on open bed trucks, and the convoy passed by where Rinpoche was sitting, so he had a good view of their faces. Chinle Chodron was looking straight ahead, steadfast and fearless. She reminded him of the heroines portrayed on Chinese propaganda posters with their proudly resolute poses, utterly determined and seeming to glow from within. 3 elderly Tibetan women sat near him, spat at her, and pelted her with refuse, but Chinle Chodron remained unmoved. The rebels were then driven out of the city to an open space below the cemetery of Drepung. When Rinpoche arrived on his bicycle, his view was blocked by trucks full of spectators. But one of the trucks was equipped with a crane on which only one man was sitting. Rinpoche climbed up to join him high above the huge crowd of civilians and even greater number of PLA soldiers with heavy artillery. Anti-craft air guns were pointed at the heavens as if they were about to be attacked by air. The excessive display of threatening weaponry and the theatrical staging of troops seemed absurd to Rinpoche, like the backdrops and extras in a propaganda film. Then the prisoners were thrown from the trucks, kicked to make them stand up again, and ordered to run. The firing squad lined up and a soldier gave the signal to fire. The crowd surged forward to see the victims and the army almost lost control. Photographers pushed their way through the chaos and took pictures of the 16 bodies, which were then buried on the spot without ceremony. Rinpoche had climbed down from the crane with shaking knees when 2 soldiers dragged a young man with a shaved head over to a vehicle, threw him roughly into the back, and drove off with him. Pulled out of his distress by this reminder of the constant need for caution, he hastily left the scene of brutal horror and was relieved when he got back to his room in Tonga. Rinpoche was young and strong and took the hardest work on himself. When the spring labor in the fields were done, he went with 3 other young men from the People's Commune to procure firewood for the peasants. Wood was scarce in the immediate vicinity, and it was a 14-hour trip to where the wood was collected. They started off early and completed the journey in a day, although it should have been a 2-day trip. Each man led 5 donkeys, and on their way out, they could at least ride the donkeys. The strongest donkeys were unruly and stubborn, so his companions only rode on a small animal. But Rinpoche did not wish to take advantage of the weak animals. He tied one hand fast to the saddle and mounted one of the powerful, fractious donkeys that periodically kicked and bucked until its rider was thrown off. But Rinpoche always remounted and tied up his hands even more tightly, riding only the wildest donkeys. The 4 young men would reach their destination after dusk. Early the next morning, they left the animals grazing at the campsite, and with long, heavy ropes on their backs, they climbed the steep mountain flank. In a clearing where the slope was less steep, they laid out their ropes according to a certain system, cut the willow branches with large sickles, packed the branches together in sickles. Do we have a sickle? Packed the branches together in tightly bundled rolls, and sent them flying down the slope with powerful thrusts. This book does not have that symbol of the sickle. Interesting. Okay. Anyways, you probably have seen it somewhere. In Mexico, for example. The bundles that got stuck in the brush had to be retrieved and rolled down further. Rinpoche could not keep up with his more experienced companions who could chop off the branches with astonishing speed. In about 3 or 4 hours, they had tied all their loads into bundles and sent them rolling, and on their way down, they collected dry wood to make fire for tea. Rinpoche always took longer, finishing the load for his last donkey while the others were already down below, and his companions were usually done with their midday meal by the time he joined them in camp. After the break, they loaded up the donkeys and walked to a village where they spent the night. Thanks to their speedy work, they had the next day off. The donkeys grazed the entire day, and Rinpoche and his companions rested up for the difficult return journey, which would all be on foot. Ahead of them, one summer, they went to gather wood from a mountain directly above the monastery of Serpu, the main seat of the Karma Kagyu. Let's see if we have a Serpu monastery in here. Rinpoche was curious to see what had become of the monastery. He climbed to the summit from which he could see the monastery, or what was left of it. Standing in a field of grass before it was a bare mountain slope on the other side. Although it was quite far. Okay, this is Dargay Monastery, 1947. Rinpoche could make out the red and yellow walls paintings on the inside of the remains of the walls. This is like a color reference for the red and yellow. Okay. For the most part, the rafters and pillars had been dismantled and carried off, causing many of the walls to collapse. This is like a nature view. Nature view. On his excursions with the donkeys, Rinpoche occasionally encountered teams of workers carrying long wooden beams that had been dismantled from Serpu Monastery to the district capital to be used for new buildings. 10 men, each shouldering one mighty beam, walked in step to marching songs to ease the transport of their heavy loads. Hey, ho! One time, Rinpoche lodged in a house near Ganden Monastery. All of the wood in this house, beams, pillars, doors, and paneling, had come from the monastery, which the local population had stripped for the use in the building houses for themselves. Here's like the early Karmapa representations. The truly tragic aspect of these events was the fact that Tibetans themselves were the instruments of destruction, although only a few did so freely. In some cases, Chinese propaganda had done its work subtly and with astonishing efficiency, while in others, the threat of being subjected to inhumane tribunals or worse, torture and labor camps compelled them. This is from the Rubin Museum. They also have an event this week, meet and greet in New York. So, yeah, Heavenly Kings in Yunnan. Some kings of Yunnan. The final truth taught in Tibet's greatest historic monastic centers was the Buddhist principle that all things arise through causes and conditions, change and decay in an endless process of transmutation. Some venerable temples had endured for centuries, and all had been expected to endure centuries more. But first they were plundered by the invaders, and everything of value was carried off. Then they were ravaged by the fanatical hordes and terrorized Tibetan accomplices of the Cultural Revolution. As the numerous buildings of the sprawling monastery complexes, some as large as entire cities, stood empty and abandoned without maintenance, they finally fell into decay. No longer treasure houses of ritual practice and sacred artifacts, the crumbling edifices were now only masses of building materials, and many thought it would be better to take away whatever material was still undamaged and put it to use. When the Tibetans removed the wooden beams from the monastery, the buildings slowly began to collapse. Buddhist rituals continually refer to the basic process of all existence, the rhythm of creation and dissolution. As when the exquisite mandalas, so painstakingly produced with fine particles of color sand, were swept away by the tantric master at the ritual's conclusion. This is Samantabhadra. No, Vajrapani. Yeah. Dorje Rinpoche is asking us to practice Vajrapani these days, if you're interested. This is a very unusual style of Garma Gadri. Garma Gadri style. It's a synthesis, synthetic art style. Thus, over the course of time, monasteries in settled areas completely disappeared from the landscape, and other edifices appeared in their place. The new town of Drikung Chu was constructed on the ruins of the Drikung Philosophy School Nima Changra. Today, a Chinese military camp is located where Yangrigar once stood. Part of a wall of the monastery was spared for a long time, though as it was regarded as the dwelling place of Achi, the Drikung protector deity, and unexplained deaths occurred among the construction workers involved in the demolition of the building. Chetsang Rinpoche was an attractive, athletic young man. At meetings of the commune, girls made a point of sitting near him, casting meaningful glances in his direction and engaging with him in conversation. He was courteous and cracked jokes, but that was the extent of his interest. His roommate, on the other hand, got married, and Rinpoche had to move into smaller and shabbier lodgings, a run-down storage room with two tiny windows in an upper part of the house where two families were already living. A hill rose at the back, and directly under his room was a sheep pen with a circular roof. Rinpoche closed off the inner door and enlarged one of the windows into a door to the outside so that he could enter and leave by way of the roof of the sheep pen and not to go through families' private rooms. To cook in his dismal chamber, he had to make an opening high up in the wall for a smoke hole. Rinpoche used bricks to make a three-part cooking area. In the middle was an aperture for a large cooking pot, and on each side of this hole for a smaller one. He placed a stone slab over the openings when he needed a work surface for preparing his meals, and old iron grates served as shelves for his utensils. By this time, Rinpoche had acquired 2 pots, 2 thermos bottles, and 2 enamel cups, and had made a ladle by nailing a tin can to a piece of wood. He brought dried young yak dung, fuel from nomads, who lived a 2-day journey from the commune, and stacked his year's supply of yak dung in a corner behind the door. His furniture consisted of a small table, a battered wooden chest for his clothing, and a bed that was nothing more than a frame, with huge holes in the rotten planks of the base. Rinpoche filled them with flat stones, rags, and old shoes, and covered everything with a mattress of yak hair that Chitsap Rinpoche had given him. The walls were old, crumbling, and damp, and the house was full of strange insects, but none of this bothered Rinpoche. One frosty winter evening, he returned after a hard day's work, lit a fire, pulled a Chinese cotton coat over his shoulders, and leaned against the cold wall to relax. Then he noticed something very cold was crawling underneath his clothing, down his neck, and onto his arm. He took off his coat slowly and found a large black scorpion perched on his forearm. What astonished Rinpoche most was how cold the scorpion felt, but he remained completely calm, knowing that he would not touch or alarm it. With quiet interest, he observed its bizarre form, waiting until the arachnid had reached his hand and then shook it off. The animal came right back to him, but Rinpoche stayed composed, reminding himself that this was an old house and there was no way to expel the creatures that had taken shelter in it. They would come and they would go. Om tare tu tare ture so. Om tare tu tare ture so. Om tare tu tare ture so. Chetsang Rinpoche's residence had changed many times over. His parents' magnificent manor house, surrounded by devoted servants, his monastery chambers anxiously attended to and shielded from the ordinary world, his existence as an urban nomad at Chitsap Rinpoche's side in Lhasa, the dormitory of the middle school, this humble, solitary room in a ramshackle building in an agricultural commune. When he thought about it, though, he realized that he had been a nomad all this life, since even in Drikung, he had changed his quarters every couple of months with frequent pilgrimages and visits to other monasteries. Seen in this light, the other nomads seemed to have a much more stable lot. They changed locations, but not their homes. A series of small hydroelectric power plants was being built to the west of Lhasa, one of the plants in the Tolung district. The authorities called on officials and public employees to dig a canal for it voluntarily, although anyone who shirked would forfeit his career and without pay as a service to the country. Among those who came to Tonga to help dig the canal was Rinpoche's uncle, Tsering Dondrup Punkang. When Punkang saw his nephew's desolate quarters, he struggled against his tears, stunned that his nephew was living in such squalor. He shook his head sadly, but then became aware of Rinpoche's perfect equanimity and serene smile, and said, "Milarepa lived in comfortless caves, and it looks like me It looks to me as though you are living just as he did. Here's Vajradhara. We have Vajradhara, our protector deity of the Gagyu lineage. And then do we have Milarepa? I think Milarepa. Yep. We have a very light-skinned Milarepa here. You know. Milarepa lived in comfortless caves, and it looks to me as though you are living just as the way he did. Rinpoche hardly knew what he meant because he had heard practically nothing about Milarepa, Tibet's legendary Buddhist yogi. The name only lit a tiny glimmer of memory from the long ago days of his childhood in Drikung. When a directive to eradicate the Abra was issued, a large-scale extermination was organized in the commune. The Chinese regarded the animals as disease carriers and wrongly blamed them for the worsening condition of the soil. It's like a pika? The area was full of abras, aka pikas, and the numerous holes they dug for their burrows was a nuisance for the nomads' horses. All of the workers were ordered to form a chain from the river to the slope of one of the mountains and pour a mixture of barley and poison from a can into each burrow. Rinpoche's can held only barley. He had managed to avoid any poison. Rinpoche had no time for religious practice, nor did he have any text or ritual objects, but he often performed a tea offering, recited mantras, and began to refresh his memory of the sacred text that he had learned by heart, although he didn't think that Tibetans would ever be granted religious freedom or that he would return to monastery life. Fortunately, he did, and that is why I'm reading his biography today. Chetsang Rinpoche's aunt and his cousin Jigme came to visit him one summer and innocently inquired in the village as to his whereabouts, asking for the Drikung Tulku. The young people did not know what they were talking about, but the older villagers' eyes shone when they learned that Drikung Kyabgong Rinpoche was living in their midst. They wanted to know where he was and if they could see him. In winter, Rinpoche took large loads of hay to Lhasa on a horse-drawn wagon. In exchange, he was to bring human manure back for the farm. In Lhasa, the courtyards had large latrines that were shared by a dozen or so families. Usually, the Tibetans threw ashes from their ovens onto the sewage to neutralize the odor and soak up moisture, but now there were hardly any ashes and the cesspools were very wet. Rinpoche had to climb down into the pits, shovel the muck into large sacks, and heave them onto the wagon. He transported the manure back to the commune, where the villagers added waste from their own latrines to it. The mixture was left to ferment for a few weeks, and then Rinpoche had to climb up onto the gigantic steaming heap and turn it over with a shovel or pitchfork. In spring, he loaded up the donkeys with the fertilizer and spread it over the fields. In the Pahari areas, it's called gobar. Gobar utado, gobar spankto. This is like the daily routine of Pahari friends. His physical appearance began to change after a few years of this hard labor, and it seemed to him as though his youth slipped away from him. They're excavating antiquities, but it looks like gobar. In his glory days as a soccer player, he had been very fast, nimble, and agile, but no longer. Nor was he as flexible as he had been, and his sense of balance had deteriorated. Rinpoche's muscles had stiffened, mostly from carrying heavy loads, especially the wood used for making tsampa. A particular kind of thorny wood that burned with a very hot flame but was exceptionally difficult to obtain was used to roast the barley. In the region around Tolung, the wood grew only in the north on a mountain near Yangpachen, where dangerously strong winds arose in the afternoons. The thorny wood was harvested in two-person teams, and Rinpoche would set off with the strongest man from the commune, starting up a steep path at 3 in the morning. Wearing thick gloves to protect them against the thorns, the two men cut the long branches into smaller pieces and tied the bundles in a special way to keep them balanced during the descent. The bundles could not always be rolled downhill. They often had to be shouldered and cautiously carried past the high cliffs across stretches of stone and gravel where they would otherwise start an avalanche and endanger those who worked down slope. Carrying these heavy loads on the steep slopes was especially hard on Rinpoche's knees. Once Rinpoche was late and the afternoon winds were beginning to rise, he tied everything into a single large bundle that weighed 80 to 90 kilograms, heaved it onto his back, and began his descent. Lifting the bundle back onto his back each time he stumbled or lost his balance, and it was a torment, and he slipped under the load several times, falling into the thorny brambles. His whole body ached when he arrived at the foot of the mountain, and he could barely go on. He made his way back home the next day, only with great difficulty, and his joints gave him trouble for the next 10 years. Okay, thank you very much, guys, for listening. That is the end of chapter 10, and please support this publication called From the Heart of Tibet, the biography of Drikung Chetsang Rinpoche, the holder of the Drikung Kagyu lineage. And I hope to see you guys during the next live.